We're talking about the PlayStation 6, and it's going to be wild. Today, we're diving into some of the biggest questions everyone's asking. What kind of chip will power this beast? Are we sticking with AMD, or is there a chance Sony might make the bold move to Intel? And let's be real, what's happening with backwards compatibility? Will it run games from the PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, or even go deeper into PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 2 territory? Heck, could it even support Xbox 360 games?
Oh, behave.
Then there's the question on everyone's mind. When will it hit the shelves? Are we looking at 2027, or could it sneak in earlier? And how about that price? Are we looking at a steep $700 like the PS5 Pro? Or is Sony going to throw us a bone with a more modest $500 starting point? Will it still come with a disk drive, or is that headed the way of the dodo? Now, the biggest question of them all, will the PS6 finally be able to play games with path tracing? And finally, what will make the PS6a must-have on day one? Let's dive into all this and more right now on Daily Hub Ranks.
Yeah, baby! Yeah.
Here's what we know so far. It's pretty clear we're going to hear more about the next-gen PlayStation sooner than later. Sony's senior VP, Naomi Matsuoka, hinted earlier in 2024 that the PS5 is entering the latter stages of its life cycle. While that's not an outright confirmation of the PS6, it's a pretty strong signal that things are moving behind the scenes. We don't have a hard date yet, but there's been some serious speculation. The biggest hint? An official Microsoft court document from the Activision Blizzard acquisition. It suggests Sony could lose access to games like Call of Duty by 2027, which could line up with the launch of the PS6. This matches Sony's usual console cycle. The PS4 was around for 7 years before the PS5 dropped, and if history repeats itself, we're likely looking at late 2027. This is where things get dicey. Pricing is always a gamble, and without solid specs, it's hard to pin down. Based on previous releases, it's hard to imagine the PS6 dropping for less than $500. But given the rising cost of cutting-edge tech and inflation, we might be looking at $600 or even $700. Considering the PS5 Pro is already priced at $699 without a disc drive or stand, that higher price tag doesn't seem too far-fetched. It could sting for early adopters, but if the console is packing some serious power and features, it might just be worth it. Let's talk about the guts of the PS6. While there's no official word, we're almost certain Sony will stick with AMD. Moore's Law is dead claimed with 100% certainty that AMD will continue powering the PS6, just like it did with the PS5. If true, this could mean excellent backwards compatibility and an easier transition for cross-gen games. As for other hardware, it's likely we'll see a major SSD upgrade. After all, the PS5's SSD drastically cut down load times. And by 2027, we'll probably see a minimum of 2 terabyte storage, especially if there's a digital-only model. I think the 1 terabyte thing is over with this current gen. The leap from a Gen 4 SSD in the PS5 to a Gen 5 SSD for the PlayStation 6 feels like a natural progression. So why should you care? A fast SSD does more than just cut down on loading times. It also helps with how quickly assets are loaded in open-world games. For example, ever been running through a game and suddenly objects or textures appear out of nowhere? That's called a pop-in, and it can break immersion. Stuttering or lag can occur when the game struggles to keep up with loading assets. In games with dynamic weather, time-of-day changes, or large numbers of NPCs, with how important load times have become, a Gen 5 SSD could push the boundaries even further, potentially eliminating wait times entirely. This would be huge for open-world games and complex, resource-intensive titles that thrive on fast data streaming. It is said that a weaker version of PSSR is on PS5 Pro, but the full power would only be unleashed on the PS6. If this turns out to be true, we could be looking at an incredible leap in gaming visuals. Now, the biggest question of them all, will the PS6 finally be able to play games with path tracing? Short answer, there is no short answer, but there is a chance. Here's why. Based on the progression of past PlayStation console generations, we can make some educated guesses about how much more powerful the PlayStation 6 will be compared to the PS5. The PS4 was around 10 times more powerful than the PS3, particularly in terms of graphical processing and CPU performance. This leap allowed for higher resolutions, 720p to 1080p, improved texture quality, and faster load times. The PS5 marked another significant jump, around 2.5 times more powerful than the PS4 Pro and 10 times more powerful than the base PS4. The most notable upgrades were the switch to SSD storage, support for 4K gaming, ray tracing, and much faster data streaming. Given that each PlayStation generation brings massive improvements, we can assume the PS6 will aim for a leap of at least 2 2 to 4 times the power of the PS5 in key areas. With advancements in AMD's architecture and PlayStation's own innovations, like PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, the PS6 is likely to offer 2 to 3 times the graphical performance of the PS5. The PS5's Gen 4 SSD already drastically reduced load times. With a Gen 5 SSD in the PS6, we could see another 2 to 3 times speed increase in terms of data access and load speeds. This would translate into near-instantaneous load times for large open-world games. While ray tracing is a fantastic enhancement for more realistic lighting and reflections, it's true that it serves as an interim step towards even more advanced graphics technologies. Path tracing is indeed a step up from ray tracing in terms of visual realism, but it's also way more demanding on hardware. Here's why it's too much for even the PS5 Pro. Let's define each one just for context. So, ray tracing. This technique simulates how light rays interact with objects to create realistic lighting effects, like reflections and shadows. It's already quite demanding because it requires a lot of computational power to calculate how light behaves in a virtual environment. Path tracing. Instead of just simulating the primary paths of light, path tracing calculates the entire journey of many light rays as they bounce around a scene. This includes all the indirect lighting, which can involve multiple bounces off various surfaces, creating incredibly realistic global illumination. Why it's too demanding? The PS5 Pro, while powerful, is still fundamentally limited by its hardware. Path tracing requires not only a high number of calculations per frame, but also needs to handle a lot of data in real time. This means you need a tremendous amount of GPU power, a ton of fast memory, and an efficient cooling system to prevent overheating, all of which push the limits of what's feasible in a consumer console. Even on high-end gaming PCs, path tracing can bring systems to their knees unless you're using the latest and most powerful GPUs. Yes, the PlayStation 6 is likely to support path tracing. While the PS5 already introduced ray tracing, it's limited in terms of the complexity and accuracy it can handle. Cyberpunk 2077's overdrive mode, which pushes even the most powerful GPUs to their limits. By the time the PS6 releases, with next-gen AMD RDNA 4 or 5 chips, and possible enhancements like PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, it should have the horsepower to run path-traced games at reasonable frame rates. It will likely take advantage of advanced GPUs to handle the heavy computational load. Next-gen SSD technology, likely Gen 5, to keep data flowing fast. Path tracing might be selectively implemented in certain games, especially for indoor environments or specific game modes where the visual impact is most noticeable, rather than being used universally across all titles. Let's talk about the crazier speculations. One of the coolest rumored features is built-in wireless charging for accessories like controllers or even VR headsets. Imagine no longer having to deal with messy cables or charging docks. Just drop your controller onto the console, and it charges automatically. This would streamline the setup and add convenience, especially for people who are into VR or regularly use multiple accessories. Speaking of VR, we're expecting the PS6 to lean heavily into virtual reality. With PSVR 2 already a pretty impressive piece of tech, the PS6 might bring even tighter integration. Why it matters? Built-in support for VR could mean lower latency and higher resolutions, which would be a game changer for immersive experiences. Whether it's through new hardware or optimized software, the next generation of VR might be a core part of the PS6's appeal. Sony is purportedly keen on ensuring that the PS6 is backwards compatible with prior generations of PlayStation hardware, so it seems likely that the next-gen console will yet again sport an x86 architecture that can run PS5 and PS4 titles. However, the more pertinent question is whether Sony will finally crack the conundrum of PS3 backwards compatibility on the PS6. With PS1, PS2, and PSP emulators now available on PS5, the only missing piece of the puzzle is native emulation for PS3 games. Since there are hordes of great games still locked on the PS3, full backwards compatibility could be a huge selling point for the PS6. Sony has filed an interesting patent that may rely on AI tech in order to operate. The patent is for a robust predictive assistance solution that leverages artificial intelligence to study play patterns through a predictive lens and then react accordingly, providing tips to players when needed. For example, if a player is trying to beat a boss but repeatedly fails, the patented tech would give the user an on-screen hint on how to defeat the enemy. Sony already has something similar to this with the PS5's Game Help feature, but that isn't reactionary and is instead a series of static wiki-style tips and tricks. Sony's patent would be more dynamic, smart, and highly conditional by contrast. In one embodiment, the patent would collect player telemetry data based on how they play and use that data to build a player characteristics profile. This profile model could be analyzed by a special AI processor built right into the hardware. In this case, a theoretical PlayStation console. It's also worth mentioning that cloud servers are referred to many times in the patent, so the AI processing may not be dedicated hardware-based chips found in new PlayStations. The patent gets even more interesting. The tips and tricks wouldn't just show up on the screen, but could also show up on the controller's face as well. This of course hints at a PlayStation controller with an actual display screen, specifically where the DualSense's touchpad currently is. It's possible that this patent will somehow tie into the extremely interesting game jump patents that Sony has previously filed. We could also see Sony add a dedicated AI processor, potentially a neural processing unit, into its next-gen PlayStation 6 console in an effort to unlock new levels of engagement across the console ecosystem.
Yeah, baby. Yeah.
And the cherry on top? We know that the PSP3 is coming out sometime between late 2025 and 2026. This has already been confirmed by Jeff Grubb and Tom Henderson. So if it comes from them, you know it's pretty much a done deal. And this thing is going to be packing some serious heat. They're talking about almost base PS5 power in your hands. Okay, not literally, but think of it this way. If a PS5 can run a game at 1440p 60 FPS, the handheld version might run it at 1080p, or 900p, or even as low as 720p 60 FPS, but upscaled to a crisp 1080p image. Let's be real, we don't need 4K or 1440p gaming on a 7-inch display. We'd much rather have better fidelity with lighting, shadows, texture filtering, and less pop-in. Plus, it's speculated to have more PS5 Pro tech in it than the PS5 itself, so we can expect it to come with PlayStation Super Resolution tech just like the PS5 Pro. Honestly, I wouldn't even mind if it ran at an internal resolution of 540 and just upscaled to 1080p, tricking my eyes into thinking it's native 1080p. These kinds of tricks work way better on smaller screens than on a big 55-inch TV. We also recently saw job listings in Japan about Sony trying to get people to assist them with getting their games working on different architectures, which has led people to believe that this could be for the new PlayStation Portable, maybe using ARM architecture. As we know from past interviews with Insomniac, they clearly stated that games like Spider-Man 2 and Rift Apart require fast SSD speeds for the gameplay mechanics they implemented. Personally, I was skeptical, but when I played the two games, I understood what they meant.